Hello, 1301. This is my lecture on some of Jane Tompkins's themes. A lot of what she talks about breaks down to the nature of subjective versus objective truth. In 2020 terms, like the concept of alternative facts. I don't think I'm that old. When I was a kid and I'd watch the evening news instead of Beavis and Butthead, if Dan Rather was doing the news, whatever he said happened that day, how many people died in a war in the Middle East, a bill, generally, when I was a kid, we believed what the anchorman says. But 2020, as I flip the channels now, one channel might be a Democrat channel, the next channel might be a Republican channel. And the news of the day is different in relation to Trump or wearing masks for COVID-19 or whatever. I would say back in the day when I was a kid, it was a lot nicer to think there was just one truth. There may not have been, I should say one objective truth, that with a capital T, it is the truth, versus the truth being subjective. There's many different versions. But in terms of 2020, it's the concept of fake news, the concept of revisionist history. And I think I may have asked you in another lecture, in 1700 and 1800 and 1900, who wrote Native American history? And the answer, if I asked that to my face-to-face classes, they would say rich white men. If I said who wrote African American history in 1700 and 1800 and 1900, 2000, I don't know, they would say rich white men. Hispanic history, Appalachian history, generally in the history of America, and maybe in the history of the world, that's debatable, the rich men who were in power decided how those history books were written. The Native Americans thrived in America 300, 400 years ago, but books are still being written on them. And if you remember my lecture on the writers, history seemed to change from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. Native American culture was on the wane 1850, so this is 150 years later, but the history is changing. And one of Tompkins's main questions, if you're a history teacher, if you're a writer, if you're a student, what version of history do you believe? What version of history do you write? What version of history do you teach? As I go down my list, like how does the truth change over time? How is the truth from my grandparents' generation, 1960, how is that truth different in 2020 if Native American culture waned 150 years ago? The truth still changed. I ask, is 2020 truth more real than 1969 truth? And maybe it's vanity, but I think most people assume that the books that are written in 2020, the articles, are true. But what will people in 2050, what will readers and writers in 2050 think of our truth? And they'll probably think we were backwards, we were primitive, we were racist, whatever. So the truth shouldn't change, but it seems to change all the time. I asked, do you believe the New York Times more than TMZ? I think there's a link from Odessa College that ask about what websites you trust. And is the New York Times more trustworthy, more reliable than TMZ? Some people would say it was, some people would say it wasn't. But again, in 2020, there seems to be a Republican truth and a Democrat truth. And we're kind of stuck in the middle. The next section, I sometimes when I teach this class or a humanities class, I ask about the nature of anthropology. I ask if you're a writer, white male from Chicago, Is it okay if you go to Bali, an island off Australia, and study that culture? And the reason I ask that is what you think is normal if you went to Northwestern and grew up in Illinois, your parents, your teachers, your schools sort of conditioned you what was American normal. So if you go to Bali, an island off Australia, you apply American norms to that island. Should Balinese anthropologists be the ones who are writing Balinese culture? Should a rich white professor study African American culture in 2020, or Hispanic American culture, or Appalachian American culture? My point is, if you're Hispanic American, shouldn't you be the one studying your culture? Or if the professor from Northwestern is trying to help, is that okay? Another question, which I mentioned in my review of the writers, if you grow up to be a history teacher and the lesson is Native American history, how do you teach that lesson? Do you go with the textbook? Maybe you pick a 2019 textbook, and when you teach the class, you assume you pick that textbook, it's a good textbook. You teach the truth that's in that book, or no, you have to open it up even more. Every event, you have to look at different angles, different perspectives. This is what the white people said about the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is what the Native Americans said about the Battle of Little Bighorn. But, maybe there's no Native American text on that battle. Maybe Native Americans dealt more with a visual, emoji culture than they did with, textbooks. So how do you get to the truth of that? More importantly, you're a history teacher. You want to do a good job. What do you do to teach that lesson? My note says the truth about Native American history in 1920 versus 2020. Again, Native American culture was on the wane 150 years ago, but the truth has changed radically from 1920 to 2020. I asked, can we trust white male writers from the past? If I open that up to my face-to-face classes and ask that, they usually say no. So how do we ever know the history? Well, it's possible